Hello and welcome to the ISID Speaker Series. My name is Timothy Hodges. I'm a professor of practice in global governance at ISID, the Institute for the Study of International Development at McGill University. I'm really pleased you've joined me today. And I'm delighted to introduce my close colleague and a fellow professor of practice at ISID, Michael Brown. In addition to his role as professor of practice at McGill, Professor Brown is a former senior mediator for the United Nations in Natural Resources and Conflict, a director of Canadian practice of the Consensus Building Institute affiliated with both Harvard and MIT, a senior advisor who is currently active with various UN agencies, and the lead author of the UN publication setting out the United Nations approach to natural resource mediation and conflict worldwide. I should also mention that Michael works as a mediator in Canada on indigenous land claims and resource governance issues. And if we do have time, I'd like maybe to explore his role here in Canada, in addition to his international work. But today, principally, we will be focusing on the international aspects of his work. And we'll ask Professor Brown to explore issues around natural resource conflicts, mediation, and international development. Professor Brown, as a starting point, can you explain what kind of resource conflicts you work on and what kinds of development challenges underpin these?
Happy to, Tim. I guess to start, I work on a wide range of resource conflict issues across a wide range of geographies. In terms of the resources, or resource sectors, I work on conflicts related to land and territory, water and energy, and by that kind of cross-border water conflicts, hydro dams, transmission lines. Mm-hmm. I also work on conflicts related to the extractive resource sectors, mining, oil and gas, and I do a lot of work on land and property disputes, particularly in the chaos of post-conflict settings or post-conflict countries. In terms of geographies, I worked across large parts of Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and dozens of different countries. But with the United Nations and other international organizations, the work tends to take place in transitional political environments, in which resources and related conflict dynamic are closely tied to political instability, violence, or armed conflict. So I guess when you kind of think of these environments, think of situations where you have all the, if you want to say it, the classic development challenges, but they tend to be more concentrated, more complicated, and more acute, than in whatever you'd want to call a regular development setting. And I guess as part of this, the conflict and tension that typically gets expressed, along ethnic, religious, or cultural lines in these settings where I'm doing the work, but it tends to play out around land and natural resource issues specifically. And this is because these are high value, limited commodities, fixed in location, to a certain extent, easy to fight over, but also the high value factor. They can, very high economic terms and or very high in symbolic or cultural value. So in terms of development challenges, there's a pretty long list that, intermix in different permutations depending on context. But I'd say kind of big ticket items, the things that tend to trigger or drive most resource conflicts. They include the kind of, classic development challenges, but with a spin towards resource issues. And by that, examples, weak governance, weak rule of law, especially the institutions that handle resources and land, whether it's, licensing or land titles, land administration issues. Second, limited access to justice. Now, particularly, these things get very complicated where there are no viable means to resolve the resource disputes and the resource tensions in a way that is accessible, peaceful, and seen as legitimate and fair to all parties. You also have all sort of the structural and systemic inequalities and inequities, be they economic or specifically related to issues of ownership, tenure, and access to the land and the resources themselves. Issues of corruption are commonly part of the equation. You may have limited political will to actually resolve or change things. Sometimes that's tied to issues around elite capture, who owns or controls the territory, the resources, or the profits. And all of this is kind of, I guess, interwoven with the overall limited local or institutional capacities, with a classic development challenge. So I guess in many ways, this kind of serious resource conflicts, they represent unfortunate but predictable symptom of some of the big challenges we face in international development, more generally.
Thank you very much, Michael. As a follow-up, what about the link between mediation and international development? If I've understood correctly, these two fields haven't always worked in the same spaces.
Yeah, actually, you're spot on. For decades, mediation in the international domain and international development have operated in very different and mostly separated spaces within the United Nations and other international organizations. On one hand, you've got the formal track one international diplomacy and mediation operating exclusively within the political silos of international organizations. Here think diplomacy between senior state representatives, ministers of foreign affairs, that kind of thing. On the other hand, you've had the development work happening within the technical agencies, issues around economic development, governance, health, infrastructure, whatever. And there was extremely little overlap or cross-fertilization between these two universes. Now, to be clear, one can still see these divisions between the political and the technical within the international system. And these divisions remain kind of fundamental challenges to a lot of the kind of work that I do around resource conflicts. But at the same time, one can also see a pattern in more recent years in which mediation-related activities are starting to interconnect with and link to more general development activities. And one can see this at multiple levels. At the policy level, the UN's current approach on resource conflict mediation, it's largely captured in a publication that you mentioned when you're introducing me, but it's an explicit joint initiative between the UN's political arm, Department of Political Affairs, and one of the technical agencies. In this case, it's UN Environment Program. But one of the central themes and the purposes of that work is to bring development best practices to bear on mediation and to put it into the hands of the people operating in that international mediation universe. And this is publication that's widely used around the world. At the programming level, there are growing numbers of kind of major UN initiatives that have been developed more recently that are using mediation and mediation-styled approaches to address, prevent, or resolve resource conflicts. I can see it increasingly in different parts of the world, in different regions. Over recent years, I've helped design initiatives Sri Lanka and Philippines, Guatemala, and Nepal. And you can also see this at the level of conflict engagement on specific disputes. We can see a growing number of specific resource conflicts in which these kinds of development principles and practices are being used to help prevent and resolve the disputes. And in many ways, this is a concrete expression of the changes at the policy level and more programming and more focus on this. I guess to wrap that up, I'd say that this kind of cross-fertilization between mediation in that international domain and development, it reflects a recognition that development-influenced solutions have to be part of the mix when we're solving problems that are triggered and driven by many of the kind of development challenges that we talked about.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm very interested in the linkages that you've drawn, and I'd like to come back to those briefly in my wrap-up. But before we finish, and we'll still have you here, as I mentioned in my introduction, I know that you work on issues related to Indigenous land claims in Canada. And I'd like you to say just a few words about this, about your work here in Canada before we finish.
Sure, I'm happy to. I mean, I guess, I mentioned, I spent 20 plus years working and living abroad, mostly with the UN, doing the kind of work that we've just been talking about. But since my return to Canada a few years ago, I've been pulled into work on land and resource conflicts, here at home. I'm working on issues around overlapping Indigenous land claims, relations between different Indigenous nations, natural resource governance, co-management around that, and dialogues that are involving the federal government, Indigenous governments, and others. Now, of course, there are obvious and very significant differences between the Canadian context and the environments in which I work internationally, the kind of environments that I've been talking about so far. But on the other hand, I can see very clearly how similar approaches to what I've been doing in the international context are equally valuable, pertinent, and relevant when it comes to dealing with disputes here in Canada, when things are deeply rooted in history, identity, and rights. Maybe I guess I'll leave it there for now, but I'd be happy to revisit this topic, some other time. I'm happy to.
Thanks very much, Michael. And as I mentioned, I can't help but, before we leave, by underscoring the points you've made in general, but also the actions that you've taken in your work, and the linkages that you've made. And I think the term linkages, interrelationships, very powerful, an important word in international development and international sustainable development. And so you've made linkages between mediation and international development, but also you've linked your experience at the international level and provide all that experience and your wisdom and your energy to helping resolve issues here in Canada, which in part are about, in fact, development, and they certainly are about reconciliation. So I thank you very much for your work, both abroad and of course here in Canada. And thank you for providing us with so many insights and such compelling experience. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and I'm sure you will join me in thanking Professor Brown for being here. Finally, please watch this space to hear more from ISID's Professors of Practice. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tim.